you hear me? I'm George Rhem. I'm the treasurer of the Bay Area Book Festival. I'm treasurer of the Bay Area Festival Board. I'm proud to say I've been a member of the board for 8 years. I've enjoyed almost every minute of it. And we're very happy to see everyone come out in such great numbers this evening. Now, I'm going to introduce our panel and ask them to come out on stage. We are fortunate to have with us one of the most successful UC Berkeley novelists of the recent past, Viet Thanh Nguyen. Tara Dorabji, another author, dealt with the issue of immigrants and otherness. And Sarris, also one of our sponsors, and someone who's dealt with the otherness of being a Native American in this culture. And now I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Ajuan Mance, also a professional who has dealt with literature and things. But before we actually begin, we're actually going to have a musical presentation, which is provided by the Bushwick Book Club, which is not, as you might believe, just a book club, but it brings together amateur musicians and composers, and they will be providing us with a musical presentation this evening, which is inspired by one of Viet's books. So we're interested in listening to what they present, and they will also be out in the foyer after the presentation this evening. And if you'd like to greet them and congratulate them for their performance, we appreciate that greatly. And the actual solo performer is Mia Pixley, before I forget to say that. And we'll welcome her now to begin her presentation.
Hi, my name is Mia Pixley, and Bushwick Book Club Oakland is awesome. And I'm very pleased to be invited here to perform one of my songs from your book. And your book was so inspiring to me. I actually wrote 2 songs, and I was like, which one should I perform? So the chapter that I wrote my song from is the joy of otherness. And on the joy of otherness, and I was just going to read some snippets that made their way into my song, and because that's sort of the fun part about Bushwick Book Club Oakland is you read the book, and then musicians perform their songs inspired by the book, and then you get to hear what parts of the book inspire their song. Like, isn't that cool? Bring me up. I'll read a couple quotes, and then I'll play my song. For you. Okay. In my case, that is the joy of otherness. An awareness that even seeing oneself face to face means that the very notion of otherness is present. One can only come face to face with oneself if one is already at least twofold, encountering oneself in an actual mirror or in the mirror of one's soul. Okay, that's one quote. It's so rich. Okay. And then you quote Fernando Pessoa, but he wrote, Pessoa writes, each of us is more than one person, many people, a proliferation of our one self, like a diverse but compact multitude, this whole world of mine. And then the last one, our shadows are a part of us and not a part of us at the same time. Seeing myself frees me from myself. I almost smile, not because I understand myself, but because having become other, I am no longer able to understand myself. Okay, so this song is called My Joy is Light and Heavy, And it is inspired by this concept of us having multitudes, and the parts of us that are maybe, you know, a little bit more palatable are alongside the parts of us that are more palatable. And sometimes they get projected outward and come right back at us. I'm a therapist, too. And so the hook of this song, I'm gonna tell y'all, because I sing it like 4 times. So if you want to eventually sing along, you are very welcome to. So here it is. It goes inside out and outside in. My shadow don't ask permission. My stars don't taunt night when they shine. My joy is light and heavy. So that's the hook.
My name is Ajuan Mance, and I'm your moderator today. I'm an author and an illustrator, and do illustrate children's books, portrait collections, and most recently also a comic collection, and which I'll be signing out in the lobby. But I want to get to the introductions of our esteemed panel. So if everyone can just introduce yourself. You've all done so many amazing things that I'm gonna let you choose what you'd like to tell our audience.
Well, I'm just really, I'm really thankful to Mia for doing that really, inspired song. It's so deeply meaningful for me. That was based on a book that I published this past, when did I publish it? In April, called To Save and to Destroy, Writing As in Others, my most recent book. It's the shortest book I ever wrote besides my children's books. I'm very proud of the children's books too. Simone, which is about a little Vietnamese American girl fleeing from wildfire in California. It was totally relevant to us. And Chicken of the Sea, which I did with my 6-year-old son, Ellison, a few years ago. And then lastly, I'm co-editor along with Isabel Thuy-Pelot and Lan Yung of a book called The Cleaving, Vietnamese Writers of the Diaspora. Also came out in April, featuring 37 Vietnamese diasporic writers in conversation with each other. And I think it's a landmark collection that demonstrates just how far Vietnamese diasporic literature has come.
Hello, I'm Tara Dorabji. Thank you for that beautiful song. It was such a beautiful gift for us all. And my most recent novel, Call Her Freedom, was published in January, the day after the inauguration, and really looks at how people live in freedom when their rights are eroded. At the heart, I'm a storyteller. I do documentary film and poetry. But this is my first novel. I've also done investigative journalism, so looking at it from all different forms, and probably my greatest masterpiece are my twin daughters, who just turned 18 and are graduating from high school.
Welcome everybody, and again, thank you, that was amazing. I'm Greg Sarris. In Los Angeles, where I used to live, they never ask you how you are, they ask you what you do, and I would always say, well, I'm a novelist, a screenwriter, a professor, and an Indian chief. What are you? And sadly, it's all true. My most recent book, which came out a year ago, is The Forgetters, and then a year before that, I had A Becoming Story. I'm also have the novel Grand Avenue, which I turned in a while back into an HBO miniseries based on the same, which I adapted. And I have a novel coming out next year. So I keep writing. I'm a member, enrolled member of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, which, by the way, supports the festival. And we are right across the bay. We're on Ohlone land here. So just in case people forget, we are here on Ohlone land. But my people are right across the water, the coast we walk in Southern Pomo.
Well, let's jump right in. Your work is really remarkable, and there were some common threads that I saw. And so my first question is about one of those common threads. In a review of your book, Greg, Levi Mendoza Strobel had a great quote, which I think pulls all of your work together, and that is, stories remind us of the perils of forgetting. And so I guess my question is about the function of memory in the work that you've created most recently. I'm particularly thinking about this time when we're seeing the defunding of departments, curricula, art exhibitions, museums that are run by and or center the histories of people of color. How can memory help that? And also, I guess the overall question is, if you feel like memory is one of your themes, why does memory matter? How does it matter, and for whom?
All right, since I was a quote of my book, I guess I'll start. For me, memory is something that's living, and it connects a past generation through me to the next, particularly as a writer. So it's key in not just negotiating where you are and who you are, but recreating the this story and passing it forward. Again, I think the parameters of culture are not are porous, where identity is fluid and moving, is particularly today. So as I recreate the stories, I'm writing in English and from largely an oral tradition that I heard so much as a kid. So I think it has a lot to do with passing on and recreating at the same time.
My novel, Call Her Freedom, is inspired very much by the independence movement in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And when I went to Srinagar, I met with one of the human rights activists, Quran Parvez, and one of the things he told me was, here we bury our dead because the graveyards are our memory, and those are the stories, and this is how we teach our children about the resistance that came before us. And one of the elders from the Human Rights Center there too, one of the things he said when I interviewed him was, they can arrest us, sometimes they kill us, but they can't kill the stories or the memory and the history and the work that we've done. You can't do that. And in my work, one of the things I do very much play with, though, is memory and how we remember, what we forget, but also what we choose to hold and give to our children. And so I think that's a really powerful part of the work and how our work becomes part of a collective memory that we reteach, building on the ancestors that came before us.
So I'm a scholar of war and memory. It's pretty depressing. The 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam just passed, and I wrote an essay for the LA Times charting how every single president, from Woodrow Wilson to Donald Trump, Democrats to Republicans, have learned all the wrong lessons from the Vietnam War, which is why after the Vietnam War we invaded Iraq, we invaded Afghanistan, and we're supporting Israel in Palestine conducting its genocide. One of the basic slogans, of course, is always remember, never forget. But if you study, as I have done, war and memory, you have to put a postscript on it. What it usually means is always remember, never forget what was done to us. But you should definitely forget what we've done to other people. That's how we end up going from becoming victims, feeling that we're victims, as in the case after 9/11 for the United States, and immediately becoming victimizers. And so that pattern of victims turning to victimizers is there throughout our history, but through many other histories as well. So there is hope. There is hope, of course. And one of we have to create that hope. And in order to create that hope, we have to do more than dwell on our own victimization. So it's been very important for me not just to write about what happened to the Vietnamese people, or which Vietnamese people are we even talking about, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, the communist Vietnamese, anti-communist Vietnamese. We have to be able to take our grief and expand it beyond in order to connect it with the griefs of other people. So it's been important for me when I wrote my history of the Vietnam War and Nothing Ever Dies, that it's not just about the Vietnamese, it's also about the Cambodians and the Laotians and the South Koreans and the Americans, the pro-war, the anti-war, and so on. And most recently, I went to El Salvador. I was there in El Salvador at the beginning of February. I was there the exact same day that Marco Rubio was in town. He was in town to sign the deportation agreement, whose consequences we're living with now, with President Bukele of El Salvador. And I was there to investigate the history of American-sponsored massacre in El Salvador. And there's a long history that you can trace from what the Salvadoran army did to the Salvadoran people in a civil war that killed 80,000 people. 90% of the atrocities were committed by the Salvadoran military, who were trained by the United States. And that created the civil war and the unrest that created the refugee population that came to the United States. Some of them became the criminals that President Clinton started to deport in 1992, and some of them came back and became some of the gangsters who then became the excuse for Bukele to institute authoritarian rule and throw 80,000 people into prison, many of whom are not actually gangsters. And that has led then to this prison deportation agreement. So when we talk about war and memory, it's extremely complex, and we need to be able to reach out beyond these very narrow kinds of stories that were offered. And we're talking about the Vietnam War. It's a very narrow story for the United States, but you have to remember that the moment the Vietnam War ended, what did the United States do? President Reagan in 1983 declared, we messed up in Laos, We let the communists take over. We're not going to let that happen in Central America. We're going to stop it in El Salvador. So we have to actively try to remember what the history is, because our own government, our own national memory, our inertia of national memory is not going to do that. So here's a little bit of hope. I interviewed on this trip the rector, the head of the Central American University. It's a Jesuit university where the Salvadoran military came in and murdered 6 Jesuit priests in 1989, and their housekeeper and her daughter. And this rector, who's a Jesuit priest, was a contemporary of the murdered Jesuits, and he said, you know, I do take hope in the fact that throughout this country, people are still trying to remember in their own ways this kind of history that the nation itself, the government, would rather suppress. And so whatever the government or the nation is doing, we ourselves are capable of remembering, but it is up to us to keep alive these memories that the state would rather suppress.
Directly into the next question I was going to ask, which is, what is lost when there's no longer anyone who can remember?
Well, that's like asking what happens when there's no air. I want to just tag on what Viet said a little more, because the real challenge in my tribe, at the time of the Europeans came here, there were 20,000 of us in separate nations. Today, the 1,450 enrolled members all trace our ancestry back to 14 survivors, all of whom are women, or wives or concubines. The real question, the real task, as you're saying, is not to fall into or move beyond or become cognizant of the us-them that happens as a result of war and colonization, and try to recreate from the lessons of the things we might forget, a we, because it is a we at the end. And I think that is the bottom line and the greatest challenge. I see among my own people, my grandmother, who said the only way to handle white people is with a butcher knife. And if she had seen me walking down the street, she would have stabbed me. We can't do that anymore. We have to somehow look at the ways, as you're saying, that we somehow realize that there's concentric circles that intersect with all of us. And what are those? Including the pain. And what are the ways we replicate oppression in our own groups? You know, one of the things with the movements that came along when I was a kid, they'd say you're Spanish, say you're Mexican, you're light, don't say you're Indian. AIM came along and they said, march in the back, you're too light. You know, we replicate illegitimacy within our own ranks, and that's a real danger. I mean, again, it's continuing the us-them. So we move beyond that.
There's this Toni Morrison quote, I might butcher it a little bit, but she talks about the Mississippi River, and that they say it floods, but it's not really flooding, right? Because they took away the river and the water remembers, and water has a perfect memory and always goes back to where it was. And so I do think that there are things that get lost through our generations, right? And even, we're all speaking English, right? And so our brain forms to that, and there's certain things that feels like they're not recoverable, and stories that get lost, and ways of being in food, and we maybe recreate it using different spices and mixes, but I do think the land remembers, and the water remembers, and so I think when we get lost for the memory, and maybe some of the memories that are given to us, we're subject to colonization, right? And are stripped down, and so we're looking under it, and so I do think that's where we can go, is to the land and to the water, because it does remember and it teaches, and there's ways that we can relearn from that deep, deep wisdom that sits in the earth.
I have a much fuller answer in this article that The Nation is publishing in a week or two. It's a 4,000-word article about me and Marco Rubio in El Salvador. But part of that article I talk about going to El Mozote. El Mozote is a town 5 hours south of San Salvador, where the Salvadoran army came in and murdered 1,000 civilians. Okay, this is like the worst massacre of many massacres that the Salvadoran army committed. And so there's a memorial there. It's very nice. And I went there and I met with 3 of the survivors. And 2 of those survivors are my age, which meant that when I was a little boy reading about the El Mozote massacre in 1981, they were little boys fleeing from the army as their families were being murdered. And so that memorial is very important, right? But it's also sort of on the tourist circuit. So if you know anything about recent Salvadoran history, you know about El Mozote, and you can go and you can see that memorial. But one of the 3 survivors said he wanted me to go see his private memorial. And the private memorial is on his own property. It's 30 minutes away from El Mozote itself. Hard to get to. We went there. He has a little plot of land on which he lives in a single-room house. And in the living room, he runs a convenience store. So you can go there, you can buy your water and your potato chips and all that kind of thing. And 10 meters away, behind a chain-link fence, he has his private memorial. And in the private memorial, there are hundreds of names and plaques on this wall. And beneath it, there are the remains of 40-some people. Can you imagine that? Having the remains of these victims on your property, of whom 24 or so were his relatives, including his mother. I was so moved by that experience because I think it takes so much to carry out this act of memory. But then I also thought 80,000 people died in this Salvadoran Civil War. Most of the massacres do not have memorials. Many of these people will not be remembered. So to go back to your question, what happens when people are no longer there to remember? I think history takes over. And so even if there are not people there who are left to remember an experience, there are historians. And I don't mean that just as professional historians. Senor Martinez, the man who had his own private memorial, he's not a professional historian. He took on himself to commemorate this event. And so I find hope in that too, that in the beginning of my memoir, Man of Two Faces, I think the opening line is, there's a thin line between memory and history. Where is that line? And so, if we look back at the history of the last few hundred years in this so-called New World, most of the massacres are not remembered. There are no memorials. We're standing on land in which massacres probably happened, and there's no memorials. So the history has to take over, and that's upon professional historians and scholars and writers, but it's on all of us too to do the necessary work for that. And the last thing I'll say is that we've been talking about this in very broad, political terms, but it's also very personal as well. To engage in the act of memory in your own family, in your own life, is extremely difficult, especially if your family or yourself have been through some kind of traumatic experiences. And it's easy to forget. And even within your own family, they'll have competing narratives of memory and conflicts about memory. So the question about who can remember when no one is left to remember can be an intensely personal question as well, as any of us who has written a memoir can testify to.
Thank you. And I love how these questions are just weaving their way right into the questions that I had already written. And so, because I'm going to tweak this just a little bit, because I feel like when we're talking about memory and forgetting, and what does it mean to either have a memorial or not, it makes me think of this notion of healing, which I feel is a theme or a subtext in your books. And so, generally I would ask a question, did you have a target audience? Did you have a reader in mind? But I'm going to ask this a little bit differently. And so my question is, if you believe that your books are in fact in some ways about healing, about storytelling or memory as healing, who are you writing to heal? Is there a target recipient or beneficiary of these healing stories?
I guess I keep going first. Well, obviously we can't separate the self. Your attempt to understand history and understand the pain has to spring from experience, something that you had pain. And one of the The best way I can think about this is a story. Mabel McKay, the medicine woman, I had been a troubled youth, and when I was 18 or 19, and she was a medicine woman and had to learn how to, the different diseases on earth and so forth when she was a young child. But she said to me, with all that's happened to you, you have two choices. She said you can let holes open in your heart and you can fill them with poison and hatred, and then poison and hate others. Or you can use all of that as doctoring and healing. Which is it going to be? You already have hatred. That's easy. Try the other. So I think in my best moments in my writing, I'm trying the other. I'm showing the pain, and a lot of people, I kind of take it as a compliment when my people say, well, you hung out all our laundry for people to see. But as a doctor, or as a medicine person, or as a writer, you have to show the light on the disease before you can operate.
I think the healing is part of the journey that's very personal with writing, and one of the gifts is people trusting me with their stories. So when I went to Kashmir, I met this woman, and there's 10,000 disappeared people. I happened to land around the time, the first time I went, when they were verifying the state was the mass civilian graves. And I met with her, and she said that she had gone to the graves, and she wanted to crawl inside, and she wanted to hug them, because those were the bones of the disappeared men, the fathers, the brothers. And later that evening, I was talking to some friends and journalists, and we were having dinner, and they were like, oh, did you meet her? And I said, yes. And she gave me the gifts of her stories, and then they were like, wait, how did you communicate with her? And of course, like me, I'm always like, oh, I'll go somewhere, and I don't think about the translation or any of that, but it was her son, and he spoke English, and so he was able to hold and carry the stories and share them. And there was this moment when my friends kind of like smiled, and they were so proud of this young man for being able to carry those stories forward. And that is a form of healing. And one of the things she said to me too is, when I think that there's people beyond here that can hear my story, that gives me a sense of hope. And to me, that's like a bit of the healing, and such a gift and such an honor to be part of that. And so in some ways I create that art with that gift in the hopes of healing, but not necessarily with the plan, because if people can take any part and heal themselves, that's such a big gift. And I know that the experience of creating this work has done some great healing within me and like the communities that I'm able to bring together. And so that's, to me, such just a gift and an honor to do.
I think there's an individual and a collective dimension to healing. And of course, individually, we should all be healed. I think our families, our partners would love it if we were all healed, and ourselves, of course. So, but the collective healing is potentially a different issue. So in this book, A Man of Two Faces, I talk about how I was a refugee, and it left me with the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. So, if that's true, I never really want to be healed from that. But it did leave individual damage in the sense that I don't think I went through anything really terrible compared to what so many other refugees have gone through. But what I did experience left me emotionally numb. That's how I survived the refugee experience. I just turned myself off emotionally so I wouldn't have to feel anything because of what I was witnessing, what was happening to my parents and what was happening to other Vietnamese refugees. But to become emotionally numb is not a very healthy thing. And when I became a husband and a father, I thought, I can't continue this way. In fact, I never wanted to become a husband, never wanted to become a father, because I thought, I don't know how to love. I can't feel anything. I can't say I love you as a consequence of all this trauma that my family went through and that I witnessed. So how can I become a husband and a father, which requires love? So it was necessary for me to be able to narrate that and to understand where this numbing and this lack of feeling came from, that it wasn't just because of me, but it was my response to the history that I was experiencing. And because I was able to articulate that and narrate that, I think I've been able to become somebody who can love other people in my life. My kids seem to love me, so that's a positive sign. My wife hasn't divorced me yet, all good. But the thing is that all of the history that produced this individual damage that I've tried to cope with, that history has not gone away. And I think that's the danger. You know, we live in an American culture in which people want to hear the individual narrative of healing. And we get catharsis out of that. Oh, you went through something that deserves a Jerry Springer episode, and then you are healed, and now you get an Oprah Book Club deal, or something like that. That's the narrative, right? And so we commodify, and we want closure to our trauma and our suffering and all that kind of thing. But in fact, I look at American history as cyclical. This is a country built on fundamental contradictions. You know, around liberty, democracy, equality on the one hand, and genocide, enslavement, and colonization, and perpetual warfare on the other. That contradiction has never gone away, and that's why our history repeats itself. And so how can we be healed collectively if the history keeps repeating itself? Everything that happened to me as a Vietnamese refugee is happening right now to these people who are being torn apart by ICE.
Yes.
Right? You watch these videos of like ICE, like, you know, tearing mothers from their children and things like this. We have not healed as a country. We're still working out our same messed up problems that have been here from the very beginnings of this country. So I refuse the idea of collective healing because our collective trauma is not done.
Boy, I have so many questions to follow up with these really interesting comments. But I'm going to kind of build on something that you were saying, Greg, this notion of the dirty laundry that can be involved in healing. And so my question is, you know, for all of you, are there certain parts of your books that you were reluctant to include in the book? And if so, what and why? No spoilers. And why did you choose to include things that you thought, that at first you thought, maybe not, but then you did anyway?
But what bothered me and what I took a lot of criticism for, especially from people, non-Indian people, and was that, you know, gosh, you must hate Indians. They're mean to each other, and this sort of thing. And I was writing with, you know, what I'm familiar with and the ways in which we fight with one another, and a lot of the stuff that we've inherited from as a result of generational trauma, poverty, colonization, and so forth. So again, back to what I was saying earlier, I can't skirt away from that if I want us to begin to be able to name what it is that plagues us. So you have to name it, and that's what language, that's what writing does. It enables you to name that. I also realize, and just as a footnote here, that as a writer, it's very limited. We write, most of us, whether we want to admit it or not, to those only who read. And in my case, most of my community does not read. So, I mean, you know, when Grand Avenue, when I wrote the book many years ago, everybody in my family was going to sue me because it was about them. Nobody had read the book. But of course, when they saw the movie, they understood what representation was and that it was about us and not literally us. But again, that's another reason why I think, as Viet was saying about the collect of our community, politics is essential, which is one of the reasons I went into leading my tribe, so that with what I know, I can be in a place politically as well as an artist to doctor and to heal and to lead. If we don't do that, writers, how many of us are actually involved in our communities, doing actual things with the children and all of that sort of thing, to doctor and heal? We can't sit in the halls of academia. We've got to get out.
There's a lot of my book that I cut, so I think that spending 14 years on it gave me time to kind of wade through it and take stuff out. I'd say where sometimes audiences get uncomfortable is with the violence of war, and particularly sexual violence around it. And I could not include that. War is messy, it is ugly, it destroys. And as a reader, you can close a book. As an author, you could not go there, but people who live it can't. And so there's an obligation to shine that mirror and a responsibility to do so. And I'd say some of the challenges in writing the book, in one portion I do go into a soldier's head and mind, and I think that's really important to do, because it is essentially good people committing these atrocities to one another that allow genocide, that allow murder, that allow war to exist. And so there's an undoing that needs to happen, but you can't undo, to your point, without seeing. And so there's a mirror that has to be cast. And I think for me, one of the important parts in writing it was to also be able to look at each of the character and find the empathy and the motivation in them, even when what they were doing went against everything that I know to be good, true, moral, those types of things, because the reality of the world that we are living in is filled with those moments. And part of the love letter is, how do we change that story? How do we change that cycle, that collective catastrophe and violence that we're in? And we have to be able to see it and see, like, you know, in that song talking about how the joy holds, like, the grief and the love, and there are those two polarities, and so being able to bring those in, I think, is really a key part of it.
This is such a great audience. They caught after every answer. I love it. I was on book tour in fall. The date is important. Fall 2023, and this young Vietnamese American woman, 20-something, stands up, and she's a fan of my work, but she says, in her parents' household, you, she says to me, are the second most hated person. The most hated person? Joe Biden. But you know, the issue is, and this partly goes back to what you said, Greg, it's not necessarily that people have to read your work to hate you. I mean, just the idea of one's work, it just gets around, right? And so, you know, a lot of people from my community, whatever you know, Vietnamese Americans.
The oral tradition.
You know, the oral tradition, it's simply that they don't even have to read the work, they just know that you have said something that violates some notion of whatever the norm is supposed to be in the community. In my case, I have my own students come up to me in class and say, my parents don't know I'm taking your class, they think you're a commie. So, and this goes to your point too, is like, once you get into these issues, like war, civil war, revolution, genocide, betrayal, things like this, it's not going to be a clear-cut issue. If you look within your own community, again, you can't, if you're a writer, you can't treat your community in a singular fashion. It's not simply the case that one's community has only been victims. Most likely, it's a complex set of factors. Victims and victimizers are found in the same community. The same person can be a victim and a victimizer. And if you're a writer or an artist, you have to be truthful and talk about human nature and its complexities and its contradictions. So I felt like I had done my filial duty to my community, the Vietnamese American community, by writing a short story collection called The Refugees, which was not a controversial book. But my first novel, The Sympathizer, was a controversial book because I told it from the perspective of a communist spy, big no-no in an anti-communist community, but then a communist spy does terrible things, big no-no in communist Vietnam. So I get, you know, I get it from all sides. But it was necessary, you know, if you want to tell, I think, a truthful story that is not simply propaganda or not simply trying to idealize one's community, to get into this kind of messiness. And the last thing I'll say about this is, you know, my poor parents, they had no idea they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your house, a writer. Because a writer's task, if the writer's task is to tell the truth, then the writer's task is also to betray. Because most people reasonably don't want the full truth told about them, the dirty laundry idea. But if you're a writer, you have to commit to the truth and to your art above all, even if it means betrayal. So the only question is, how can you ethically manage that betrayal? That is a very serious artistic problem that I think we all have to confront.
You know, in my family, they always say, "Here comes Greg, don't say anything."
Well, you know, building on that, maybe, sort of, kind of, how did creating this book in any way, shape, or form, and the answer may be not at all, but how did creating the books that we're talking about today change you?
I don't know exactly which book. All of the books changed me or transformed me in some way. My second book, my big novel, Watermelon Nights, many years ago, I mean, it's told by 3 different narrators, but the first one is gay and is one of the first times there was a representation of where American Indians gay, that sort of thing. And I talked a lot about the ways in which this young man wanted to help his community at the same time the community was going to ostracize him. So what we lose when we delegitimize those within our own ranks. So, I mean, that was a lot about my own experience in lots of ways. But the other books are, the essays becoming stories are always about my dialogue, and I see identity as an ongoing dialogue with memory, with the present, where you're always negotiating things. And so it was a wonderful experience to write essays where I'm integrating as much as possible on the page of my dialogue about who and where and what I am. The last book, The Forgetters, is basically love. I was in love, and I am in love. And I think, I hope. And so the stories are all about, the things that we might forget when we get into, in various ways, when we begin to think of ourselves as the center of the universe rather than a part of it, and the trouble that we get in each time that happens. So they're reconfigured tales told by 2 crows. It could be crows or it could be women, and are both. Have this where they clap after this is a first.
I had it happen once. Portland's a great literary town. Not as literary as Berkeley, but I think that, but it was pretty close.
I think working on this novel for so long, I changed, the world changed. I'd say one of the biggest gifts that came out of it was definitely the friendships. So the second time I went to Kashmir, I know that my ability to go could become limited because of the reporting I've done, how I share the story, and so the second time I went, I did decide to bring a film crew with me. You can't really film there if you're foreign, so there was some risk in that. And we were filming during Ramadan, and people just really opened up, and so I was able to talk with many amazing human rights defenders. And there was this one moment, it was super hot, and because we had to have the fans off, and I just remember and the battery died on the camera. And in that moment, I started talking with the young woman who I was interviewing, and it was like that 45 seconds to change the battery was enough for us to close a friendship that I believe will be lifelong. And so that's just been like one of the most amazing things, is being able to continue to work with her and be part of her growth and support that, and her support me. And so those relationships are a huge gift. And I'd say like one of the things that really changed, I'd say in terms of the art that was really fun, is I think early on I was just so focused on capturing the war and what was happening in this violence, right? The violence that goes into the communities that's then in the house, right? That's like, we can't separate it. It like sucks into our relationships. That I didn't always capture early on, the resilience, the joy, the culture, like what grounds us and keeps us going. And so that was something in my work that I was able to go back through and really add, which was joyful. And I think too, it just mirrors in my own life, like my practice of even when things are hard and you're grieving and you're sitting in your grief, being able to also hold the lightness and make space for it every day in small ways. And so I think that's been one of the gifts in this creative practice.
And the last book I published is called To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other. And these are lectures I gave at Harvard under this series called the Norton series. And the Norton series, some of the writers who have given these lectures include T.S. Eliot, Jorge Luis Borges, Italo Calvino. The last writer was Toni Morrison. So when I got the invitation to give the Norton lectures, I thought, you got the wrong guy. This must be a case of mistaken identity. And this has happened to me before. When I was here at Berkeley, for example, there weren't that many Vietnamese American English majors, but one of those Vietnamese American English majors was also named Viet Nguyen. And his professor hated him and thought I was him, so that's a whole other story. The theme of mistaken identity and imposter syndrome is a theme in this book, To Save and to Destroy. And it's a theme of what it means to be an other. I mean, I'm sure so many of us, part of our experiences of otherness, whether it's an individual experience or a collective experience, is that oftentimes we feel like we're being mistaken for somebody else. Even the person that we think we are may not be who we experience ourselves to be. And a lot of us deal with imposter syndrome. Do I deserve to be here in a particular space? Do I deserve to be at Harvard or in the canon or something like that? And I think one response to that is to say, I do belong here. And if this is the canon, if this is what it means to have mastery, then I'm going to be a master. So one of the writers I talk about was Herman Melville. I studied Moby Dick, and 15 minutes out of a 30-minute qualifying exam for my PhD was spent on Moby Dick. And not just Moby Dick, one scene out of Moby Dick. And fortunately, I had read the scene. But Moby Dick is about mastery, but it's also about the perils of mastery. Like, we should not try to be like Ahab. But that lesson is completely true about American history and culture, and also something that Trump has not learned, okay? So, if we are imposters, if we are our own others, should our response be to try to compensate for that, to become masters? And the response of To Save and to Destroy is no, we shouldn't try for mastery. We should be suspicious and skeptical of mastery. And we should be suspicious and skeptical of authenticity. Because if the opposite of the imposter syndrome is this idea that if we're inauthentic as imposters, then we should try to be authentic. And that notion of authenticity is obviously totally pertinent through all of our conversations here, and especially for anybody who's been classified as an other. Part of what gives ourselves validity as an other is to say, we know what the authenticity of our otherness happens to be, whether it's our language or our food or our customs and so on. But I distrust that. Because there's great comfort to be found in mastery and authenticity, and there's great danger to be found as well. Because if the master's impulse is then to dominate and to kill, do we want to give in to that impulse? If the notion of authenticity serves to divide us into those who are fake and those who are real, and the ones who are fake are going to be subject to all kinds of punishment and marginalization, then do we want to be real? Do we want to be on the side of authenticity? So this is not an either-or question, and so I learned a lot about myself writing this book, and coming to the conclusion that the only thing I'm authentic to is my own inauthenticity. And it's that kind of paradox that I think is, for me, one of the more important lessons of grappling with being an other, not to try to claim authenticity and the mastery of our otherness, but to dwell in this paradox of the authenticity of inauthenticity.
I have so many other questions I would love to ask and get answers to, but I think it's time for your questions, I imagine. And so if you can line up right here. We've got a mic, and so if you have a question, please get in line. Whenever you're ready, and I just want to say, so many interesting things. I was thinking about Frank Chin's notion of the real and the fake. I have 1,000 questions I could ask about the notion of generations, and then, the ideas of the sisters, the Crow sisters, and the relationship, how memory lives between the two of them. These things are so generative and fascinating ideas, and it's really wonderful to hear you all talk about your work, but we have more wisdom here.
Hi, thank you for the evening. My question is, how do you see your future as a writer when you're writing about the other in this times in the United States where there's a denial of history and all the anti-DEI stuff? Is it something that is frightening to you? How do you cope with it? Thank you.
Strange as it may sound, it's more opportunity to do what we have to do. And that's the bottom line. So I think if we're, as Gregory Bateson said years ago, if we're all lemmings going over a cliff, we still have two choices. You can walk with the rest and drop off, or you can scream as we go and say, hey, there's another way. I think writers and the best of my friends are screamers, just scream. And we have so much opportunity now to scream. Do it.
Yeah, I think it's a double down. I agree in this time, and I think it's also what's really important is to continue to give to other artists in their spaces for them and young people for their stories. So it's a time of more stories, more perspectives coming out. I do think that it does matter, like in this country right now, that Mahmoud Khalil is incarcerated for organizing, and free speech is under attack in a way that in my lifetime perhaps I haven't seen, but I don't think that that's a moment where you stop. And one of my friends who's actually a human rights defender in Kashmir, who is incarcerated, he's been incarcerated for 4 years, one of the things he was saying as a joke was like, don't worry, you can write books. Because they won't read them. It's what you post on social media, you have to be careful.
They don't read them, that doesn't stop them from banning them. I think the question I brought up the DEI thing, and what a tricky situation, right? Because I don't even like DEI, honestly. But now DEI is being attacked, so now so many of us feel like, well, we have to defend DEI for obvious reasons that I don't have to rehearse here. But I think one of the things we have to be careful about is that just because whoever we are being attacked, doesn't mean we should respond in the same way. Because what's going to happen is that then the attack moves the center. And by that I mean, now we're being forced to defend DEI when there have been so many things that have been done under DEI that are actually pretty stupid. So for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the mantra becomes this orthodoxy that prevents us from asking, equity in what? Inclusion in what? What do we want to belong to? Do we want to belong to a corporation? Do we want to belong to a military-industrial complex? That second part doesn't get asked. We just want to belong. And if we're just responding to these right-wing attacks, then the defensive measure could be, well, yes, we just want more people of color in the army. Okay, I don't know if that's a great response. So to go back to the otherness issue, I think otherness is both an identity and a principle. And the problem is these two things get confused. And of course, sometimes we have to organize our otherness around our identities for very obvious reasons, to advance our interests and so on. The danger is that the interests can become calcified, but the identities and the interests can become calcified. And that's when you have sort of reactionary identity politics, and I think we're all aware of what that is. Like on the Asian American side, for example, do Asian Americans now have to claim Kosh Patel? Do Asian Americans now have to claim, Usha Vance? I mean, is that what the identity is? No. And so then otherness as a principle becomes really important. What are our principles what do we believe as others? And for me, the principle of otherness is always to recognize who is the other, who is the victim, who is the cockroach, who is the monster. It's not always us. It's not always us. So at one point in time, yes, Asian Americans in some populations were marginalized and discriminated against. Still happens today. But in a lot of cases, Asian Americans are part of the establishment. And so it's not in our interest as Asian Americans to simply defend ourselves. We have to defend others. That's the principle of otherness that we have to maintain.
The other thing, too, is the DEI thing misses or assumes that race, religion, sexual orientation presupposes point of view. It does not. And that's one thing we always have to remember.
Thank you so much. I have a question regarding war and memory. In Mr. Nguyen's book, Nothing Ever Dies, one quote that stuck with me is that all wars are fought twice, the first on the battlefield and the second in memory. And I think grappling with this paradox of collective versus individual healing, I'd love to know a little bit more about how a lot of us in the diaspora, especially in the Asian diaspora, who don't have lived memory or understanding of many of the wars or atrocities that have occurred in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. How do we deal with wanting to build solidarity and community while not having any lived remembrance in the wars that we seek to remember?
Great question. There were a lot of questions too. That's why I love that. It's a great question because I think the answer oftentimes is just simply it requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of intellectual work, academic work, emotional work. I'll give you two examples. Tessa Holz's Feeding Ghosts just won the Pulitzer Prize in memoir. It's a comic memoir, a comic book memoir of 3 generations of a Chinese family. And it's exactly about your question. Tessa Holz is this mixed race descendant of a Chinese grandmother who suffered through the Cultural Revolution and so on. And the only way for Tessa Holz to do her book was to do 10 years of work, learning Chinese, going to China, investigating her mother, her grandmother's dead, and then learning how to be an artist and spending 10 years of suffering writing this beautiful book. And so I think at the end, there's no way of getting around that. There's no way of getting around that. And I've had to do it, and you might have to do it, and we all do it in our own ways. But I think the point of optimism here is that for those of us of this generation, your generation, my generation, so much of that work has actually been done. So it's not as if we're the first ones in a lot of cases to ask these questions generally, although we may have to be the first ones in our family to ask these questions. And that can be hard enough, as the Tessa Holz memoir describes. But we were lucky that in a lot of the cases of the Asian diasporas and other kind of diasporic or war-torn histories, there has fortunately been scholarship and memoirs and histories and things like that. And if there hasn't been, that's very difficult, but you know what? You can be the first, and that's also its own advantage as well. But I'll give my own example, which is Palestine. That's not my war, that's not my history, and so on. I had to do a lot of reading to even have a beginning of an understanding about how to understand what's going on today in the present, to work against the the propaganda that infiltrates our entire society around the question of Israel and Palestine and anti-Semitism, to try to be able to answer these issues for myself. And there was no one who could do that work but me, but fortunately, of course, there have been so many Palestinians and Jewish and Israelis and Arabs and Muslims and artists and scholars and writers who have done the work that we can turn to that. So if you are befuddled and you don't know how to respond to these questions today, all you gotta do is read some books.
Hi. I was really interested in the discussion of the paradox of the victim and the victimizer, and how there's good in both those who are the victimizers. It really reminded me of a quote from Rumieza Oster, who was one of the students, this tough student abducted by ICE, who said that the ICE agents told her, we're not bad people, we're just doing what we were told. And I was thinking a lot about how you all have held in your books the perspective of the victim and the victimizer, and been able to work in that paradox, and how difficult it is now reading those stories, to not just feel like the anger and the attack against these people who are victimizers. And I was wondering how you all handle that and what is your advice or consales for those of us who are watching these atrocities occurring.
I mean, I think that's one of the central questions because it's so heartbreaking if you really hold it, the type of atrocities that we commit, and some of the deepest ones are for people that are closest to each other. And so in my work, sometimes, I mean, the nice thing about writing is you do drafts, so sometimes I'd come out with like really hardline characters, but it's not like that. And so being able to really take somebody or a relationship that has that victim perpetrator and let it switch over time, right? And then where do people find their harmony and try to like see if you can disrupt that cycle? Because I think there's the institutional part of it, right? Where you have good, smart people in these institutions signing up to do horrific things to one another, right? And then that cycles, because it's systemic violence, into our families and communities, where now we live in a world where any day, here we are, and it's like we're teaching our children that they can be shot in their schools. Like that's the cycle of the world of the violence. But these are people that are loved, these are people that are cared for at some point. And so that is, in a sense, the complexity of the human experience. And I think when we can start to be able to, one, have that mirror, and like that's why the monuments are important too. And for these atrocities, and when we are in a place where there's been mass genocide and we don't mark it, we're missing a piece of the collective experience that we have to reckon with, because we're walking over it, right, each day. So I think there's that part where we have to memorialize those things that have happened, and that inside of ourselves and each other, and that allows the light, I think, in one another to come up more and more. So I think that we do have to see it, to start to shift it, and that collectively we also have that responsibility in each moment, right? Are you gonna choose sort of the anger, or are you gonna choose the light? And in a world of increasing chaos, it takes a lot of time to ground in that light each day.
A very good question. One of the things that we need, I know that on a personal level, to acknowledge that you are simultaneously, or can be and have been, a victimizer as well as a victim. It's humility. It should remind you of your humility. You're humble. You're not just totally a victim, and therefore, you know, we can of course trade on our victimness if we want, and so on and so forth. And by doing that, we're in many ways hurting others. And we have to nuance this, and it's humility, again, I think is so important in the individual before you can even understand how you are both. You have to see your sins as well as your strengths. I'm gonna come out of the closet here. I'm a UC Regent. And so recently there was a meeting of the Regents. Well, I am somewhat of an anomaly. Recently there was, you know, a lot of protest and so forth. And I remember, you know, the Regents and the police all saying, don't go out there, don't go out there, don't go out there, it's dangerous and so forth. And of course, being the rebel that I am, lunch came and I snuck out there, and of course they're all screaming at me, because, you know, I'm a Regent and they're screaming, and I really just said to them, shut up, and listen for a second, just shut up. And they said, well, your mother's a Jew, we know about you. And I said, yes, but my father's an American Indian, and I want you all just to remember for a second, just to nuance this a little bit, that all of you are standing on occupied land. Now let's talk.
I think that's an important point, you know. So in A Man of Two Faces, this memoir, I talk about how, if you're a refugee, you want empathy for yourself. You know, poor refugees, you know, gotta tell the refugee story, blah, blah, blah. But in A Man of Two Faces, I try to confront the fact that when we came as refugees to the United States, where did we end up? What was our first point of arrival? Fort Indian Town Gap, Pennsylvania. Why was it called Fort Indian Town Gap? Obvious reasons. And you know, my parents bought a house as soon as they came out, and they bought a house on a place called Paxton Township in Harrisburg. The people of that area, the Susquehanna, the Conestoga, most of the remaining survivors were massacred in 1700 by a gang called the Paxton Boys, and we bought our house on Paxton Township. So that kind of complexity, I think, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're all implicated in different ways, and so if we start from that, it becomes easier, perhaps, for us to have empathy, even with ICE agents, even with regents. Okay. Just kidding.
I'm trying really hard here. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep going, but they need a screamer. I'll just...
So let me say this, I mean, in the world of art, the idea of empathy is given a lot of emphasis, and I'm going to talk about that, but let me just say, empathy is not the only tool that we have. I mean, I really do think that we can deploy other things that don't require empathy in art, like agitprop, satire, things like that. Those don't require empathy, okay? But for a lot of what we do, empathy is required. And you know, we like to talk a lot about that as artists, and now it's become a political issue. Like, we as artists have always said empathy can bring us closer to other people, and it's true. And now you have Elon Musk saying empathy is bad. And you know, some empathy is a negative emotion. Like, even Christians are saying empathy is bad. We want to limit the amount of empathy that we feel. So all of a sudden, the political value of empathy that we as artists have always known about, that political value has become even more important. I'll just give you one example to illustrate that, to answer the question, and that is the movie The Zone of Interest. I mean, The Zone of Interest is about a Nazi death camp commander, told entirely from his point of view. We never see the victims that are living and dying literally right over the wall of his house, his compound. And the movie's entirely focused on his point of view. So we do have empathy for him, and that movie wouldn't have been possible without a great degree of empathy for Nazis. But nevertheless, that movie renders a moral and political judgment. So it's totally possible to be empathetic even to the worst people and still render political and moral judgment. It doesn't have to be a both and symmetrical kind of thing where you're like, oh, if I have empathy for the Nazis, that means like they're just the same as the Jews. It's not true. But you have to have empathy for even the victimizers in order to understand how power and evil operate, not just in these villains that we like to cast out as the Nazis, but also within us, our own society, whether or not we agree with ICE, whether or not we agree with Donald Trump. In fact, they are Americans, we are Americans, we're produced out of the same history and the same culture, and we have to understand that in order to understand how these people are, you know, claiming that they're good people too, they just have to do their job. That's an excuse that has happened throughout history. And honestly, when we get to the question of how complicit we are actually all complicit. None of us we want to go out and arrest immigrants, but we're paying our taxes that pay for the bombs that we drop on other people. We are complicit too.
We also eat the food that they provide for us.
Hi, thanks so much for your really insightful answers. So publishing, like all industries, is inequitable, right? It's just a privilege to be able to enter that industry and be able to give voices that traditionally have not been in the U.S. publishing industry. And I'm wondering what responsibility we have if we come from communities that might not have a lot of representation. How do we balance this sense of giving humanity, but also knowing that we may be one of the few who are currently coming out? Do we have a responsibility there to think about the stories we're telling?
I'll jump on that one. I like to quote Arundhati Roy. Okay, so first of all, I mean, maybe this has happened to you too, you know, but I've been called a voice for the voiceless, right? And I really reject that label. Vietnamese people, we're really loud. No, we're not voiceless. So I quote Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy says, there's no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. It's absolutely true. And so that poses a question, what are we supposed to do as writers or artists or as members of artistic communities? And I think what that means is that we shouldn't aspire to be voices for the voiceless. We should aspire to abolish the conditions of voicelessness. And I think that verb abolish is really important because it connects what we have to do as writers and as artists and as editors and as publishers and as readers with the work of abolition in general. I mean, what it means is that we actually will not achieve what you're asking, that is to give everybody a voice simply by having more publishing houses. I mean, the abolition has to be total across so many different realms of society before we have these conditions where many different people can have voices. Now, a more immediate answer, though, is of course we have to, in our own way, in our own circumstances, try to create these conditions to help people amplify their voices. And so that's why when I was at Berkeley as an undergraduate, I was already, my friends and I, we started our own Vietnamese American arts group. We were looking around, we're like, oh my God, the representations of Vietnamese are so bad. Where are all the Vietnamese American voices? Well, there aren't that many, so we have to help to create these conditions. And so we started a group called Ink and Blood. Very melodramatic, perfectly appropriate for Vietnamese people. And 30 years later, Ink and Blood is now the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. Much more boring, but more 501c3, nonprofit, friendly term. But that group then led to this anthology that I mentioned at the beginning, The Cleaving, Vietnamese Writers in Dialogue, 37 writers. Our work is to bring opportunities to writers, to create audiences. We've had residencies with artists from several different countries in different places, from here in California to New York to Vietnam to France. So there is hard work to be done there, but again, what that work demands is that we do more than try to bring attention to ourselves or our individual voices or our celebrities, but to try to create conditions for more and newer voices to emerge and to support them.
I'll co-sign on that. I think as part of my artistic practice, how I pay it forward, how I create conditions for others is central. So sometimes I work as an arts administrator in organizations where we get resources to resource young people, creatives, artists. And then in my own practice, it's really like, I look at how much of the revenue can go back into the community. If I can't get it directly into the community, who then can you support from the diaspora? And so I do think it has to be really deliberate in the way of who benefits from it and who also you can help uplift. And so I do think that passing it forward is really, really, really important. And I remember, recently somebody was like, well, you have to make it first. And I'm like, no, you don't make it first. You just do it as part of the process, is uplifting one another. And I think that's really important. I also think it's essential to think about, like, who are you bringing with you in your story? And usually there's someone who it really does matter to me how they would see the story. And so I do ask for that editorial feedback and take it really seriously. And I would say too, specifically in this writing, I definitely had several men, they didn't like certain ways that I was portraying men in the book. And I remember there's this one part, and this guy was just like, that would never happen. And I was like, but that did, and that was one of your, like, this was a human rights defender, and like, this is what her husband did. And I ended up taking that out of the story, not so much because of what he said, but actually because my writing group was like, why does this character have this happen? I was like, because it happened. And they're like, yeah, but you're taking something and you're forcing it upon a character and you're not letting her do her thing. And so I do think that in fiction, there's a play between also opening up like what your character needs to do. And sometimes the communities that you're writing for and with and about aren't gonna like what you have to say, and it's important to authentically be able to share those truths, right? And it goes back to that there is no perfection, and if you have somebody that never makes a mistake, is always perfect, they're not representative of what's actually happening. And the ways that the violence comes through, and I keep talking about that, but it does, it comes into our families, and that's some of the places that it's ugliest and it's hardest to write about, but we do have a real responsibility to show that so we can transform it.
One more?
Yeah, I think we might have time for 2 more, depends.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My question, I guess I know some of the younger writers and newer writers who started out writing as another, and sometimes the practice of writing as another is very liberating, at the same time constraining. So I wonder if you have any experience of if you have experienced being feeling both liberating and constraining at the same time when you have to write as another, the other not talking about the principle but more talking about identity. And what would be your advice to the younger or newer writers who do not have so many books published?
I'll answer quickly with a story. I was at Stanford in the writing program, and I was writing about California Indians, my community, and the professor said to me, "Who are these people?" Because of course he couldn't imagine Indians that weren't on a Pinot horse chasing buffaloes. So he said, "You're never going to be able to publish these stories." And I kept going and kept going. Of course, once I got a job as a professor, I knew I wouldn't have to be a bartender or a ditch digger. I picked the stories up, got a lucrative 2-book deal and an HBO deal. The moral of the story is, your story is your power, whatever it is. Write it.
And I would say, write with other writers. One of my writing group members, Faith Adiele, is here, and my work wouldn't be what it is without other writers of color. And so, women, writers of color, surround yourself with other writers, follow your passion, and keep going. I think that's what it is, and only you can tell your story.
So I give the example of writing this book called The Refugees, a short story collection, 17 years of misery writing that short story collection about Vietnamese refugees. And part of the misery was not just about learning the art, it was a sense of obligation to the Vietnamese community. Am I going to tell the right stories? Are they going to like the book or not? That's very much wrapped up with being an other. And what happened was that after I finished writing that book, I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to write something just for me. And that was The Sympathizer. It was enormously liberating to get to the moment where I felt, I'm just going to write for myself. And I think that's what I wish for you. I think for all writers, obviously we have to have some kind of sense of ethical responsibility to our communities and our families and so on, but in the end, you're writing your book for yourself. It is so hard to actually do that. I think it's as hard to do that as it is to actually acquire all the technical and artistic things you need to do. It's a psychological and emotional breakthrough when you can write for yourself, because then you're not worried about not just your family or your community, but also editors and publishers and reviewers and all that. So it's really hard to get to this pure space where you're writing just for yourself. And one final example, the other is not just some kind of abstraction like an ethnic or racial or religious community. The other is sometimes just the person right next to you. Like my mother or my children. These are really strange and alien people to me. And these are the others I have to contend with on a daily basis or throughout my entire life. And with my kids, when I had kids, what was really great or terrible was that these kids had no rules. They were totally free. They could do whatever they wanted. And I was like, how come you get all this freedom and I don't? But I actually learned a lot from that because, yes, you have to put boundaries on the kids, but then I saw they had so much freedom. And I was reading children's literature and I realized children's book authors and illustrators, they can do whatever they want. They have absolute freedom. Why is it that when we're adult writers, we feel all these obligations and responsibilities? And then I read the poets. And the poets can do whatever they want. No one ever asks, why does a poet do this or that on the page? But if you're a fiction writer or a non-fiction writer and you deviate in some way from a form, people are like, why, my God, why are they not doing what they're supposed to do? So in fact, in the end, being authentic and true to your own story and to your own voice is also about finding this ultimate freedom to be courageous and do whatever you want, no matter what the authorities or your parents or the rule makers are telling you. That's where the real freedom is.
And this really is our last question.
Thank you for all of the great responses tonight. I think it's been really eye-opening. But I know during one of the discussions you mentioned that we are stuck in like a cycle where we like forget, like temporarily remember and then forget. And I was thinking, we also talked a little bit about individual and collective healing. And I think collective healing could really like change and like almost break the cycle in a way. But you know, it's hard to move towards that, especially since there are a lot of people who may not realize that we need collective healing, or they may realize it, but they just don't care enough. How do you think we can move more towards collective healing as individuals and as a community when that's going on?
You almost had said so much there, thank you. For me, of course, I always thought that it would be teaching and just writing. But in thinking about my own community, again, most of whom aren't readers, what do you do? How do you heal that community when most do not read? And ironically, we built a casino. And we became successful. And as a result, again, with leadership and kinds of ideas and looking at what we're doing, we have now turned around a 60% dropout rate to 100% graduate from high school. So you have people who can think. We also last year were the largest tribal contributor to the Democratic Party. And we were, again, financed half of Proposition 1 to constitutionalize women's reproductive rights in the state. So we do great things, but the greatest accomplishment is to convince my people, my tribe, to do that after years of colonization, being victims, being lured by materialism when you've been poor and had nothing. That's where there's change. The community is seeing the advantage of doing what our ancestors did, take care of one another in the modern world.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we've got to wrap up. Thanks again. Just want to mention our sponsors, the Federated Indians of Graton, Rancheria, and Saatchi. Thank you so much for your support. There will be a sale out in the lobby